My name is Nicola Hickton and I'm going to talk to you about marking, feedback and assessment. I'm going to look at this in general, but then also consider the journey that we've been on at Putteridge High School, where I am an associate assistant head, and my experience as a result of working for Chiltern Learning Trust, where I have a role for standards across English. The first thing that I obviously did was look at the research to do with marking, feedback and assessment. At Putteridge High School, I felt that staff were doing an incredible amount of marking, but I questioned how meaningful it was. I questioned their work-life balance and how effective it was. So obviously I started looking at the key areas: Ofsted, DFE, EEF. Something for me that was quite monumental was their 2016 paper on market improvement, which really set out the 3 M's: meaningful, motivating and manageable, but also made me question what we were doing at the time. I then had a look in more detail at things, in particular like the effectiveness of self-assessment, peer assessment. I was really taken on a journey with the 2020 How to Create More Impact with Less Marking by Richard and Richardson. Equally, new things like teaching walkthroughs all have amazing structural and well-researched ideas to do with marking, feedback and assessment that mean that we as teachers can do less that is more effective and more efficient and more meaningful, and hopefully create a better work-life balance. 2 key quotations then from 2018 and 2019 is that assessment is accurate and based on high quality evidence. I thought this was quite interesting, and I questioned our quality across the board at Putteridge High School. I didn't question the teachers' effort and the commitment they had, but I just wondered whether what we were doing was actually the best practice at the time. And then also the idea that pupils' work across the curriculum is consistently of high quality, again, just fed straight into this. And made me consider our old policy and then the changes, which I'll talk you through. So first of all, our old policy was that a teacher did a piece of marking for every subject every 2 weeks. Obviously, this is quite incredible feedback for the students. It's frequent teacher marking, but the con to me was that actually it placed all the ownership on the teacher. It had a high workload, and it meant that much of our curriculum time was being spent around planning for and doing assessments. What I wanted to do was to shift that focus on the teacher and place more independence on the pupils. So then we moved on to our new policy. Our new policy then was 1 summative formal piece of assessment to be marked by the teacher per class per half term. This was obviously quite a drop, and therefore we needed to then also add in some formative assessment. So we then added in any 2 of the following: self-assessment, peer assessment, marking on the move, whole class feedback sheets, and then new for 2020, when I've just been updating the policy, is feed forward. The idea of all of this is that, yes, the student has their summative, formal teacher feedback, but actually through self-peer, marking on the move, whole class feedback and feed forward, they should also be looking at mark schemes themselves. They should be criticising their own work, working with peers to be constructive in their comments and moving forward independently. Obviously, the cons is that there's less teacher feedback, but the higher quality with the focus on the exam language and the progress updates. So progress updates were also a new thing that we implemented, which were to go with each assessment, and I'll show you that in a few slides' time. The pros then: teacher workload, the choice. We hadn't had this before, and I felt that because we had such an emphasis on summative assessments so frequently, we were missing the resilience and the reflective process that the students get through self and peer assessment, obviously good self and peer assessment. And also it embedded the progress language within the lessons through effective methods. We looked at GCSE criteria and we increased our challenge for the students, which is always obviously important. Our policy then, as I've said, looks like the following. And what we had, though, were a few exceptions. So we're now in year 2 of this, and it was quite difficult, I guess, at times to make sure that this worked for every subject. It took us a long time to think about how to do it to the best way that we could, but also with some subjects that they couldn't do what we were saying. So we did have to put in place some exceptions. And all I would say is that this is about making a policy that fits your school and your teachers and your students. So, for example, BTEC subjects, some of them cannot, due to the exam board's limitations or expectations and requirements, they cannot give students feedback in this formal way. Philosophy and ethics lessons, our students do that, and we realise that because they don't get assessed in it and they don't get a GCSE, that we didn't need staff to complete formative assessments, and actually that was hindering rather than helping the students. So we were aware that we had to put some exceptions in place, and we did that through working with our subjects. The other thing that we did is I created a shared Google Drive, because the whole point of this was making it more manageable for staff and reducing, not increasing their workload. So it was no good if we were going to change the policy and then expect them to create everything. So we had a new shared Google Drive for marking, feedback and resources. Within that, we had folders that every staff member could go to. We had actually 2 Google Drives, one for all staff and one where we kept the trackers that was for heads of departments and senior leaders. The idea of this is that I made templates and we were sharing the resources. So as a team and as a school, we could be collaborative. This is just one example within there. So that's how it started off. And then what happens is that other subjects added on their whole class feedback sheets. So history, maths. And that was a new thing that we'd implemented. We hadn't used whole class feedback before. So it was important that this in particular had a great model and a great template that staff could take, they could adapt, they could use, but it meant that it could reduce their working. And I in particular love whole class feedback sheets. The other thing we realised is that our expectations perhaps weren't high enough for the students, and some of their books weren't a good enough standard because we weren't putting that emphasis on quality. So the first class books on the left hand side is the original poster or template that we had at the start of every student's books. And initially that was fine because actually it was about getting their presentation right. And with that, we hope that everything would become more effective and more efficient, and they would take pride in their work, and that would then be reflected through their written quality. And what we then realised is that we needed to shift to the new one for 2020, where actually it's about raising those aspirations. And I feel that we were able to do this because we've already come so far in the time that we've had this marking policy in place, that we're now at the next step where we can really increase that challenge, our aspirations for the students and the quality of their work. The next thing I want to just mention is the summative assessments and the progress updates. So the summative assessment wasn't new, but the progress updates were. So the idea of the summative assessment is obviously to inform their progress level. There's one assessment each half term per subject. And it's also to help with things like data checks. So it coincided with data so that staff could mark an assessment and then they could fill out any data checks. We didn't want staff struggling to do this. We didn't want the marking to be at different points. So we were very careful in how we put forward the marking points. The other thing that I should say is that we changed how many times we looked at marking. And over the past 2 years, it was 5 times a year. Before that, it had been 6 times a year. And the problem was that obviously in the initial half term, staff were having their books checked before they'd actually had a chance to do the marking. So again, it was starting off on a bad foot. And what we did is we looked back rather than looked forward. The progress update sheets coincided then with the teacher assessment. The idea was that there was one sheet per assessment, a slight tweak I've made, which I'll talk about in a minute. They used the GCSE criteria or our Key Stage 3 levels. We use green and pink highlighters to talk about what they've done well. So green is great, and then think pink. Staff got stamps to reinforce this, just to get it into the students. And equally, students then, when they started doing things like self and peer assessment, would be using the green and pink as well. And it was about it being embedded into the books and the student work. Students then always responded to summative assessments in green pen. And this is then a little example of their green pen response. I've obviously just signed it off at the end to show that I've had a look at it. This is a closer look then at a progress update sheet. So a change from last year to this year is that we realised that actually they only need one of these per unit of work, and where a unit of work might go over a few or say 2 half terms, they didn't need multiple progress update sheets. So a change to our policy this year is that they have one progress update sheet per unit. They're still going to do one assessment a half term to match the policy, but they might not necessarily need 2 sheets. The idea of the progress update sheet is essentially exactly what it says. It's a snapshot and an overview of what the assessment was and how the student did on it. And we've developed these quite considerably from the initial stages. So it gives a specific comment for the student. Some of the tasks we've then added in. And what I've realised over the years is that obviously as you mark books, there are normally a set of comments that are applicable to many students. So that's why I've started adding in tasks once I've had a look at a few assessments. The progress update sheet is set out as follows. So it's got the title, it's got the assessment question, and we want students to flick through their books and look at these rather than look at a grade like they had been doing previously. If they want to know how to improve, they come to their progress update sheet. They look at whether they're level 4, and then they think about how they can move to a level 5. And obviously the idea is that criteria increases, but we also give staff options. It doesn't have to be levels, it could be grades, it could be progress stages, it could be marks. The assessment objectives then are always there to match the piece of work. And then we added in the waggle. It's what we use at Putteridge, it's what a good one looks like, or part of an exemplary answer. And the idea was that students from student voice and feedback said that essentially the initial sheets didn't have a waggle and they didn't have the assessment objectives. And they wanted to be able to look back at their work and reflect upon their assessments. And they thought that this would help them considerably. What I should say is that this went through quite an extensive student voice discussion and panel, and I had 7 different versions of this progress update, working with the students and making changes depending upon different classes and their requirements and what they would like before we came to an agreed template. This is quite a busy sheet, but it was what our students wanted, so therefore what we used. I'm not saying this would suit all students in all schools, but it was important to have that collaborative process so that it was right for our students. And the feedback as a result of the changes were extremely positive. Other things that we then said to staff that they could include if they wanted were more explicit literacy, keywords, sentence stems, starters, reflection questions, or even subject-specific terminology. And what we want is for staff to adapt these and utilise these to match their subjects and their assessments and their departments, but also to their classes. So whilst we might have a template in English, it might be that we then adapt it slightly for our classes, which is absolutely fine. The next thing then is the formative assessment types. So with the policy, staff do 2 types of the following: self-assessment, peer assessment, whole class feedback, marking on the move, and now feed forward. The first one I'm just going to talk through is whole class feedback. This was, I don't know if it was necessarily a new initiative, but it really came about 3 years ago. And it was a way to provide feedback to a class and mark a whole set of books, but reduce the time that it took, still, however, being as efficient. Now, I find the best way for this to work for me is that I look at a sample of books and then I start to fill out the what went wells and the even better ifs as I'm marking. I then have all of the what went wells and even better ifs on the sheet for the whole group, and then I will highlight the specific ones for those students. Everyone then gets a copy of this and they stick it in their book, so they know what specific what and well applies to them, and also what, even better, if they need to apply to their green pen and their progress. I know that people do them differently. Some people, the what and wells increase, and it's the more that they do. But essentially, the whole idea was that we provided a template and that students and staff use them for their subject, and I wanted it to work for them. We've had some brilliant feedback with these. It provides whole class feedback, personalised feedback, because it is then personalised to the student, and it means that teachers can mark a set of books in normally an hour, which for me as an English teacher was quite a monumental difference. The next thing then was self-assessment and peer assessment. Again, I provided a whole range of templates for staff to use. But what I would also like to say with this is that it didn't have to move away from spelling and key vocabulary tests if that's what you needed the students to be doing. The purpose of the self-assessment and peer assessment was that it was effective and clear, but also that it still matched what staff and teachers and students needed. What I will say about self and peer assessment is that research shows that when it's done poorly, it can actually hinder a student's progress, with comments where students write things like good piece of work, nice writing, or even better if write more. So I think it was really important to share with our staff members about modelling self and peer assessment, and to model that with students, and to start off with checklists and mark schemes for them to look at, just like the progress updates and like we would as teachers, and then to perhaps withdraw some of this structure when students were really efficient in what they were doing. And what we then found is that actually the peer assessment they were doing was absolutely incredible. They were applying the mark scheme, they were highlighting in pink and green, they were giving really constructive comments that moved everyone forward, rather than simple reflective comments that were not necessarily helpful. The other one is the typical marking on the move. As you go around the room, you target students and you just provide some feedback to them. Again, I tried to stick to the pink and green just for it to be clearer for them, and I asked them to kind of add to things in green pen. The thing with this that is obviously a little bit trickier is that you either need to make a note of the students that you've seen that lesson and target different ones next lesson, or what I did is I just got students to hand their book to me if I hadn't got round to them after, say, 3 lessons time, to ensure that everybody had had some feedback. The final formative assessment that's new then for next year as we move forward in September is that we're going to do something that has come about from me doing new research and reading, and it's called Feed Forward. This essentially stems from the fact that we quite often have that one student that has done everything we wanted them to do, and actually to give them a comment to go back and change something in their work isn't necessary. We want them to look forward. So we use teacher or peer feedback to inform a new piece of work. It could also be when a student has just misunderstood or completely struggled with a task, and actually it's a way of them applying what they need to do, but to a new task or a new activity to give them a fresh start. I don't have any examples of this as yet, but obviously we will do from September onwards as we start to utilise it. What I will say is a few slides previously on the progress update, I did some feed forward reflection questions. When students had done an assessment, what I wanted them to do was reflect upon that moving forward, rather than improve a certain paragraph or response. The next stage, I guess, then is how we implemented tracking and feedback. So for 19 and 20, we tracked their work in 3 ways. So I created a departmental tracker for every single department. There were 5 reviews throughout the year, starting at October half term, looking back, as I said before. The idea then that this was embedded within the whole school. So it was in the schedule, in the calendar, the marking point linked to the data checks. We constantly spoke about marking point 1, marking point 2. So the language became embedded within our school and wider community. Staff then completed the tracker for those they line manage. So, for example, our head of English would fill it out with the English team. There was 1 page per staff member, so marking could be tracked throughout the year, and I would support anyone that necessarily needed any support individually within departments. The other kind of thing is that I often joined departments to have a look at what they were doing to provide support, or even just in departments where they had lots of split classes, it might be that I took a year group and actually checked the books for them. We didn't specify how we wanted this tracker to be completed, so heads of departments might take a sample of the books, they might do it in a department meeting, they might do it individually with those teachers. We just said that we wanted staff to collect at least 5 books and to vary the classes they looked at. The idea that by marking point 3 was that every book for every student or every class should have been looked at least once. And then by the end of the year, every class would have been looked at multiple occasions and feedback would have been given. One of the things that we got back from staff was that actually there was little praise or kind of celebration to do with marking. So the other thing I created was a whole school tracker. So once the departments filled out their individual subjects, I then collated it all together to create a whole school tracker that you can see in the centre there, and copied over the ragging. Everyone that then received a green could quite simply get a postcard to do with their marking. And we also then celebrated departments that had done whole class feedback sheets or something that had been quite remarkable in the books. There were 5 postcards for the 5 marking points, and the idea was that staff wanted to collate them all, and I would write a little comment on the back based on the comments from the head of department trackers. Initially, and I think throughout the whole of last year, it was absolutely successful in moving us forward for consistency, for reducing teacher workload, but I think creating a more effective marking policy within the school. At marking point 1, we had 98% of teachers green and 2% of red. The thing I should note is that we had 10 additional teachers that hadn't as yet had their books looked at. By marking point 2, 94% green. But as you can imagine, this is an incredible percentage of books that are being marked and looked at. 6% amber. I should also say here that unless the teacher assessment was done, a teacher could not be given a green. So 6% amber is for formative assessment rather than the 94% green. Sorry, the 94% green is the teacher doing their assessment. By marking point 3, we dropped down to 84%. However, we had now covered all class bits, all gaps within the school. So it was a drop that we were expecting, and it was still above our target, or my target, which is 84%. What became clear though was that we needed to progress with this. And whilst this was initially great in terms of doing the tracking, what I wanted was to take this one step further and to now, in line with Ofsted changes, the new curriculums, the concept of deep dives, to now really have thorough, thoughtful, considered and detailed book looks. So for 2020 onwards, from September, student work is going to be tracked in the following 3 ways. We are going to do what we're calling a work review, which is now a change from the marking and feedback tracker. This will be 3 times a year, not 5 times a year, because it's about having quality, in-depth conversations, not just completing the exercise, and it's going to work on a Google form. There will be leadership lesson visits, which is going to be replacing our observation structure. There will be 3 a year, and again, they will be doing the same Google form in terms of the books to review the student work. And this is all about consistency and creating this joined up practice and picture. And then we're going to do subject leader learning walks, which is what we have had this year. And they will complete a subject leader Google form, which will just have a snapshot of marking and feedback and assessment questions to do with their student work. The whole idea for this is that it is a collegiate look at marking and feedback and assessment, and it is perhaps providing a clearer, more rounded and much deeper perspective than we had before. The main one then is our student work review. So the Google form is new. It looks at standards expectations, just like the tracking sheet, so it has that element to it. But what I felt was really important from the changes to the Ofsted framework were this massive, obviously, notion of curriculum progression. And also for us as a school, it was for next steps, for CPD, for sharing the exemplary practice of both the students and the teachers, and to have this dialogue that was about deeper questions on marking and feedback and assessment. So 3 times a year, a head of department is going to fill out the Google form. And what I've managed to do is to get it to then collate the information for staff to create a postcard. So this information that you'll see in a minute is, when I show you the tracker, it's completely fictional. I've just made it up for the purpose of showing how it works. So if I scroll through the Google form, this is the leadership one, but that's exactly the same as the head of department one. And we're looking at the key information. The little proviso at the top then is that this is for you to do with the teacher. And this is a collaborative discussion that I want to happen rather than a done to sort of process. So the section 1 is all about key information. Obviously, we need that to make sure that people are following the policy. But section 2 is the standards and expectations, starting to raise those aspirations for our students. Section 3, curriculum progression. Obviously, we're now looking at knowledge, skills, progression of learning, the sequencing of things, and cultural capital. And then section 4 is our next steps, so that we can use this to move forward as a school and to kind of link to CPD. If I then show you the next part of this process then, which is our spreadsheet that it feeds into. So the data then feeds into essentially this spreadsheet, completely made up information that feeds into the first page. We then take this spreadsheet when it's loaded properly for me, and essentially I've done a tab number 2, and I have got it to feed that information into a postcard. The idea of the postcard is that we had postcards previously, but they were paper copies, and we would fill them out and hand them back, and this will generate it for us. So I'm going to just click the arrow at the top here. Sorry, it's being slow. I'm going to use my own little made up piece of information, and what you will see is that it should, as it just catches up with itself, automatically change all of that information to my marking, feedback and assessment for the student work review. So the idea is that all of those questions on the Google form are then shown. Staff get feedback, we know the next steps, they have a copy, we have a copy, and they will get one of these 3 times a year by the head of department and 3 times a year by senior leadership. They'll also then get the little snapshot of questions as part of the lesson visits that we're going to do. Quite simply, we then use the snipping tool to snip this and to email across to individuals. And then this is what it looks like. So they would get that in an email, keep a copy. It can go, if you want, performance management, and it just feeds into, again, the bigger picture. Obviously, this is just, again, completely made up information. So that's essentially the whole overview of everything that we've done at Putteridge High School across the past 3 years, the 2 years, and moving forward, what we're going to put in place for next year. If anyone has any questions or any feedback or any ideas or suggestions, I would be more than happy to hear them. I've added my email address onto the slide and hope that it's been useful to give you a snapshot of all of the things we've put in place. Thank you very much.